So today's topic is Azure Active Directory join and Hybrid AAD join. So which device management strategy makes most sense for your business? So our main speaker today is going to be Tim Brandt. I will be your host. My name is Jonathan Olson. I'm on the account side, the account management side. So please, if you guys have any questions, you can drop them in the chat. We can address them at the end. Everyone's going to be muted out during this time. So it is being recorded. You're all going to be muted. So if you have any questions, just put them in the chat. If you're having any connection problems, we do have our event support. It's at journeyteam.com/BTS support. So if you have any issues, just send us a quick message there. And then during this session or at the end of this session, I'm going to drop this link into the chat as well. This is a quick survey. So this puts you into an entry for drawings for gift cards, and then we're actually giving out a Surface 4 laptop as well. So make sure that you're filling out the survey that I drop in here with. I'll probably do it with when the question Q&A starts. So welcome to BTS. I usually like to do a 10,000-foot overview of JourneyTEAM and kind of what we do and what we specialize in. So we're a direct partner of Microsoft. We're located in a city called Draper, Utah. We're about 20 minutes south of Salt Lake City, Utah. We've got about 120 plus members. Most of them are here in Utah, but we've got a couple spread out, peppered across the U.S. 300 plus active customers. We've been in business about 27 years. We have been Microsoft Partner of the Year the last couple of years. So that's a big deal when it comes to how many partners there are of Microsoft. Like we're in their top 1% of their partnership. So high level overview of what we do. So we have different teams segmented within the business with different directors and architects and developers assigned to those directors. So we have a full ERP team. We have a full CRM team. Tim is going to be talking to you today. He is on the cloud team, so he's the team lead for the cloud space. And then we have a full SharePoint team and Power BI team as well. So high level overview of kind of what we do and what we specialize in. We operate only on the Microsoft stack, and that is what our expertise is in.
So today I've been asked to cover the difference between Azure AD Join and Hybrid Azure AD Join. I'm going to take a little bit different approach to that. A little bit about me. My name is Tim Brandt. I'm a senior cloud solutions consultant. I've been in the tech industry about 15 plus years. I'm a modern desktop administrator certified with Microsoft, team administrator, and a security administrator currently. But just love tech and the growth and the things you can get from that. So keep learning is what we do. To start things out, I'm going to punch up a little quiz. I want you guys to just go ahead and answer that. Should pop up into your chat. What do you do currently to manage your PCs today? Group policy device management, SCCM, Microsoft Endpoint Manager, other cloud MDM solution, or other on-prem solution. Go ahead and submit a vote there, and let's see what you guys come back and tell us. Okay, moving around. Other on-prem solutions, some other cloud MDM. Like the majority of you are doing group device management. Cool. So there's a good mix between on-prem and cloud solutions. So that's kind of interesting. I'll take that into consideration as we move on. Perfect. To start out, I want to review something that this fine gentleman, Satya, said. Basically, he talked about how we're over a year into the pandemic and that digital adoption is not slowing down, it's accelerating. And that what we're seeing today is the beginning of what's to come. And you'll see Microsoft pushing a narrative called move to hybrid work. And that's not necessarily anything to do with Hybrid Azure AD Join or hybrid identities. They're referring to work from an office as well as work from home. And basically, the pandemic has fundamentally transformed the way we do work and do business, and the way we meet customers' needs. So this past year has taught us a bunch about how we can work remotely, and that we need to be flexible in what we do for work. Another fellow at Microsoft, Jared, said that with the shift to our hybrid work is a strategic business opportunity for every organization, and one that requires a new operating model. Now, these statements are good by Microsoft, well-intentioned, but again, the burden of making this hybrid work functional and work for everybody is falling heavily upon IT professionals to actually make it happen. And device management tends to be a key, very key to being able to support this hybrid work. And we'll learn some things about Microsoft Endpoint Manager and how it can help you deliver modern management and modern workplace to keep your data secure and keep things in the cloud and on premises. With that, Microsoft Endpoint Manager includes services and tools that will help you to manage modern mobile devices, desktops, computers, virtual machines, and a bunch of different things. So with that, got another poll for you. Just want to see where everybody's coming from. Let me know what you guys think for your company. Is flexible work here to stay, or do you think you'll get back into the office? What does that look like for you? Kind of running the polls here. Some companies haven't decided. Okay, interesting. Predominantly, most people think that your flexible work is here to stay. Interesting. But there's some that will return to quote normal business operations. All right. Now I could definitely see the return to work kind of key for manufacturing and other things that require on-site personnel, but we are seeing a big shift to the hybrid remote work movement. In another session, it was talked about the capability maturity model integration that allows you to evaluate your business needs rather than technology features. Now, this is true across the business landscape, and you may have various components in different areas. For example, identity and access management, security risk, communication and collaboration, interoperability, system usage, adoption, analytics, insight, organization rate of change, finance processes. And again, for today's discussion, device management, which I have sitting right here on a managed level, but maybe not as well optimized as we'd like. A holistic understanding of where you're at in the maturity model will better allow you to systematically plan a path forward and where you and your business wants to be and how to get there. It also helps you understand what IT technologies you need to improve first. For example, if your identity and access management is at a level 1 over here and you're struggling, your device management migration or improvement will struggle in its development as well, because your identity and access isn't where it needs to be. So perhaps you need to look at moving your identity and access to a more mature model before you get into the device level. JourneyTEAM can help you understand where you're at in the maturity model. We have a couple benefits, I guess you'd call them features we could do for you. One's called a foundational identity analysis, help you identify where you are in your identity landscape. And the second would be a Microsoft 365 tenant health check. And these evaluations give us a good baseline to understand where you're at and what you need to improve so that you can move in a systematic method and not be spinning your wheels per se. Microsoft Endpoint Manager is a very powerful tool. It can scale to your company's needs. You can roll it out slowly or quickly. It's all up to you and how you want to roll it out. To date, it can effectively manage Windows 10 and 11 devices, Mac OS, iOS, Android, Windows 365 VMs. It's a new space. We can actually implement device management on VMs through Endpoint Manager. And then they just announced at Ignite last week, soon Linux desktop management. So they're definitely moving into a broader device management scope. But again, today our focus, we're going to look at Windows 10 and Windows 11 devices and how that plays into your strategy moving forward. So within Endpoint Manager, there's basically 3 device types. There's AD registered, Azure AD joined, and hybrid Azure AD joined. And depending on which doorway you use to enroll your device, and yes, there are many ways you can enroll a device, they will end up in one of these 3 states. Azure AD registered devices, consider that your BYOD devices. You own the employee or whoever owns the computer, they own the cell phone, they're bringing it into the environment to get permission to access resources or emails or other such things. There's Azure AD joined devices. These are Windows 10, 11 computers and Windows Server 2019. And newer in your organization, running as a VMs in Azure. So for Windows Servers 2019 and 2022, it needs to be a VM in Azure, but it does show up as an Azure AD joined device, and you can actually log into those servers with your Azure creds. And then lastly, that last category is hybrid Azure AD joined devices, and these are seen as an interim step by Microsoft on the road to Azure AD joined. And this hybrid Azure AD joined provides organization support for down-level versions of Windows back to Windows 7 and also Server 2008. All 3 of these device types can coexist together in Endpoint Manager, and you can have devices coming into the ecosystem through in the many doorways and having these 3 different types of devices joined in your ecosystem. So don't think that you have to migrate entirely to Azure AD join today. You could take a hybrid approach, or you can make that move and that jump to Azure AD join. This is a high-level overview. There's a lot of detail in here of the different features and capabilities of each device type, each join type. So you can see it shows device ownership, who owns the device within the organization, or is it personal? The OS version supported, provisioning, how it gets provisioned, sign-in options with each one of those devices, and then device management and key capabilities for those different join types. I'm not going to really dig a ton into each one of these. Just know that you can grab this presentation later and kind of dig into it deeper, but they do have their pros and cons, each one. Let me throw out another poll question. This is our last one. All right, which device join type does your organization currently use? Azure AD registered, Azure AD joined, hybrid Azure AD joined, or do you do a mix of all of the above or some of the above, or none? You're not actually moving down the pathway yet. Okay, seeing a lot of hybrid Azure AD joined. The mix, good. Some people are all cloud. Azure AD joined, a small percentage, and some of you are just doing BYOD device type joins. Cool. All right, so the majority of you are dealing with hybrid Azure AD joined devices, which will play nicely into our conversation today. So we'll close the poll and we'll get into the meat of it. So here's some diagrams from Microsoft about Azure AD joined or hybrid Azure AD joined. And the reason why I pull this up is you can see there's very little difference between the 2 models. As you can see, both join types have an interaction or can have an interaction to your on-premises Active Directory. And to help us kind of understand this, we're going to play a little game. You can throw out your guess in the chat if you want, but I'm just going to throw out some scenarios, and we can figure out if the statement is fact or fiction. You have to do it this way, or there are other options to these join types. Okay. So here's the first scenario. Is it possible to hybrid Azure AD join Windows 7 and 8.1? What do you guys think? Nobody in the chat? Nobody loves me? I'm teasing. Okay, so let's dig into this a little bit. Fact. Jerry says it's fact. Okay. It is true. Hybrid Azure AD join supports a broad range of Windows devices, but know that older versions of Windows 7, 8.1, and servers requires additional or different steps to get them enrolled into your device groups. So you do have older devices. We can support that in Endpoint Manager. It's a little bit different of a process to get them enrolled, but the option is there. The most frequent place that I see these older device types is in manufacturing, where the manufacturing software they just don't have anything on a Windows 10 software yet. So they're behind the times. And so because you're manufacturing products, you really can't make the jump to get that machine into a newer state. Okay, fact. Scenario 2, group policy is required to manage hybrid Azure AD joined devices. Group policy. No. Let's look at some of this. There's a new feature in Endpoint Manager. Yep, I got some thumbs up there. It's fiction, called the settings catalog. This came out last year. It'll make you easier to make customized set of policies. There are actually thousands of settings in here now. They keep growing that monthly. And there are actually settings within the settings catalogs that are not available before to GPO. So kind of some key points here. MDM policy typically is preferred, especially in the hybrid work scenario, for simple reason that GPO requires line of sight to the domain controller, which if you're working from home, you could lose that without a VPN connection. While as the MDM only requires an internet connection. The biggest downside used to be that group policy always wins if there was a conflict of policies on your device. You're pushing group policy and you have some MDM policies on that device, group policy would always win. There's now actually a setting you can implement where you can say that MDM policy wins over group policy. So that kind of alleviated that pain point with the process. There's also a feature within Endpoint Manager where you can analyze your on-premise group policy and see what it does in the future environment. Go into your on-prem, export those group policies as an XML, and you can import that into the cloud, and it'll actually break it down and tell you which of the settings are supported by MDM providers. And it also includes show you anything that's deprecated or not available to MDM providers. So there's some cool features to actually help you make the transition and get those policies moved over to an MDM profile. It doesn't build them for you. It doesn't convert them. It just analyzes them and helps you recreate them. We're going to label that fiction. Group policy is not required to manage hybrid Azure AD joined devices. Next one. Hybrid AD joined devices are needed to access on-premises file servers and mapped network drives. You need a hybrid Azure AD joined device to get to a file share. We're talking traditional file share. You have an H drive or an X drive that's shared out in the company. It's on servers on-prem. Do you actually need a hybrid Azure AD joined device for this? Jerry's playing the smarty pants guy. Mark says fact, Jerry says fiction. All right. So here's the technical explanation of it. This little diagram. Imagine you're inside your company's network on your AAD joined device, Azure Active Directory joined device. You enter your password or your passport credentials, your hello PIN code, whatever. That credential will go to Azure AD, and Azure AD will return a token to Windows. This token is a very special token. It's a refresh token, but it's a refresh token to multiple audiences, not just one audience. And this token is used to access multiple resources, and it's used to access all resources from this device as long as the session is active. That's what is called a primary refresh token. Additionally, at the same time, if this device can reach an on-prem Active Directory DC, this device will also receive a Kerberos TGT or ticketing granting ticket That's what's going to provide SSO to on-prem resources. And all this happens on when logon time. So if your device happens to be connected to on-prem, you go into the office and you connect up, or you sign into VPN before you log into the device, you will get a Kerberos ticket and you will be able to access on-prem file shares and resources from an Azure AD joined device. Now, the PRT will also provide SSO to all Azure AD resources like SaaS apps or Office 365, whether you have this set up your environment with ADFS, or if you're using the sync with password hash to Azure Active Directory. The TGT will provide single sign-on to on-prem resources like web applications, file servers, printers, and as a user, you'll experience the full SSO to all of those resources. Now, users doing work from Azure AD joined devices that come to the on-prem network, again, are now able to enjoy the seamless access without being prompted for credentials and accessing the file shares, accessing a file server, or when printing a document to an on-premise printer. So it's pretty cool that we can, with an Azure AD joined device, still be able to access those on-prem resources. On this other hand, if you're outside of your network, they'll still have SSO to all cloud applications. But again, because you don't have access to your on-prem AD controller, you don't get that TGT, and you're not going to get your on-prem resources. Though you could publish some of your on-prem resources through what's called Azure Application Proxy or Web Proxy, and we'll talk about that in the future. Note, there are some on-prem requirements to make this work. You have to have certain server types, but it's very, very doable. So don't be held hostage that you won't be able to access your on-prem resources without with an Azure AD joined device. Very, very doable. Yeah, you do need a DC. You actually need I think it's 2016 at a minimum server to run that. So good question, Ethan. So that's the overview. So we're going to call this one fact or fiction. We're going to call it fiction. You don't need a hybrid Azure AD joined device to access on-premise file shares and MAT network drives. You get to them just fine on an AD joined device. It's a full-fledged citizen in the ecosystem. It's just how it gets the ticket. Okay. All right, next scenario. Hybrid Azure AD devices are needed to be able to print to network printers. And it gave it away a little bit on that last question, but fact or fiction? It's fiction. As mentioned before, the previous scenario, if you sign in and you have those connectors set up, you can access on-prem resources, and that includes printers. Yes, there is an Azure print server. It's this guy right here. It's called Universal Print. Now, this is kind of fun because Universal Print allows you to manage printing across the organization by location. And for those who have permission to print to specific devices, you can group devices. If you have permission to print to that device, you can. It also eliminates the need to install print drivers. So there becomes an easier maintenance portion for you as well. Essentially, this allows users to print from anywhere when connected to the internet and authenticated to Azure AD. So that is true with that universal print. So that is fiction. You don't have to have hybrid Azure AD joined devices to print. The interesting part about on-premise printing, if you don't use a cloud service, is how to get the drivers or join the computer to the printer so it can get there. So those are some things you got to work through configurations or PowerShell, and there's tips and tricks to get it there, but you don't need to be hybrid Azure AD join. All right, next one. I need a hybrid Azure AD device to be able to use on-premises web applications. These are applications you have on-prem. You need a hybrid Azure AD device to do that. Okay. Fiction. Thanks, Josh. So Azure Active Directory offers capabilities for protecting users and apps and data in the cloud. The thing we're going to talk about here is Azure AD Application Proxy. This allows organizations to publish on-premises web applications externally. Remote users who need access to internal apps can then access them in a secure manner, and again, without VPN. So application proxy for the win is absolutely correct. Thanks, Mark. So we'll label that one fiction. Next one, hybrid Azure AD joined devices are needed to use existing business critical old school applications, which requires hard-coded AD connectivity to work. Kind of a very specific scenario here. Cameron says fact. Any other guesses? Okay, it is a fact. Cameron's correct. And this is because these applications use LDAP to get required information from Active Directory, and Azure AD doesn't support LDAP as it isn't a cloud alternative of Active Directory. Now, we can blur the lines a little bit and we can say, hey, we can migrate your application to Azure, and we could spool up Azure AD domain services, which can provide LDAP services hosted in the cloud. So we can get this a little bit fuzzy and get into the fiction side of things, but you'd have to have Azure AD domain services to do that. And you'd have to migrate your application from on-prem to Azure in the cloud to get that to work. But we could get you there as well. So for the most part, fact. Okay, another very specific. A hybrid Azure AD device is needed for a wireless access point that is configured to use Windows NPS as a radius server for supporting wireless network authentication. That's a mouthful. Radius. Hybrid is a fact there, okay? We'll walk through this. There's one place that this breaks, okay? So Azure AD join device can get an internal PKI user cert and device certs through an NDES connector. So we can get you a cert just fine on the device, both device or user, it doesn't matter. We can get Wi-Fi profile to the device by device and by user context as well. So getting the Wi-Fi profile is not an issue. Radius auth works and connects to Wi-Fi when the user is logged in. But where this breaks is when Azure AD join device fails to authenticate at Control-Delete screen and tries to use a device cert and a device identity to authenticate with NPS. Because the device is not present in Active Directory, therefore NPS fails to authenticate that Windows 10 device. Now, there are some workarounds. We could walk you down this road a little bit to make this work, but it's a heavier lift and it needs to be evaluated whether it's a benefit for your organization. Basically, what we do is we do reverse sync on Azure AD Connect and sync your Azure AD join devices back down to on-prem. It creates an object, but it's not a full-fledged object in your ecosystem. And we have to do some magic on that ecosystem to convert that device to a full-fledged, quote, object on AD and kind of spoof the system and make it work. Again, it's a heavier lift, but for the most part, we're going to label this as fact. It breaks when the device tries to authenticate because there's no computer object typically on-prem. Okay. If you have that scenario going on, there's some things you got to look into deeper. All right, the only way to have additional local admin permissions on all devices is with hybrid Azure AD join devices. Now, I'm not referring to giving a device local administrative privileges. We can do standard user or admin permissions. We're talking about an additional local admin on the device. Okay, Ken says fiction. Anybody else? See some people questioning. That's good. Okay. Ethan, fiction, good. Okay, so on Azure AD joined devices, there's already present 2 members of the local administrators group. If you go into your machines, you'll see these 2 weird GUIDs on each device. One of those represents the global administrator role, and the other one represents the device administrator role. So if you go into Azure Active Directory devices and you go look at the settings within there, you'll see this little guy here sitting here and says additional local administrators on all Azure AD joined devices. And if you add users to this group or this section, their permissions, their creds, Azure creds will actually become administrators on all devices. There's some internet connectivity that still has to maintain or take place, but conceivably you could walk up to somebody's machine with their UAC prompt popped up saying I need admin permissions to install XYZ application. And you would put your credentials in there and it would validate that you're good to go and it would allow that application to load and install. So that is the built-in native way to do it. Now, additionally, there's a way to put a local administrator account on all devices with a complex password. But again, that opens up the door to lateral attacks if the username and password is compromised, or if it's not rotated in a frequent manner. So we can also dump a local admin account on the machine. Just know that you do have a security risk there that you need to take into consideration if you do that. Okay. So fiction. Okay, here we go. The only way to use local administrator password solution or LAPS is with a hybrid Azure AD joined device. Any thoughts on this one? If you want to continue to use LAPS, fact, Josh, good. Fiction, unwise, but fiction. Okay. Some fact and fiction. So for Microsoft's local administrator password solution or LAPS, it provides management of local administrator account passwords for the domain joined computers. So as far as LAPS is concerned, that would be true. That is fact to use LAPS. Again, because it's an on-prem solution. However, here's your caveat. There are a couple of solutions out there that can help with this. There's what's called lightweight LAPS and serverless LAPS. They're out of the box. They're not Microsoft driven, but they do work to varying degrees. And for lightweight LAPS, this uses what's called in Endpoint Manager. There's a section there, depending on your licensing, what's called proactive remediations. And you could use this to push a local admin account and password to computers at a regular cadence. You could actually change that nasty 32 character password every hour if you wanted. Don't recommend it, but you could do it. Serverless LAPS is a little bit more complicated and a bigger lift. And this uses Azure Function app as well as storage, and then Azure Key Vault to manage and update these creds and passwords. So it's a way to kind of get a similar feel of your Microsoft LAPS solution, but in the cloud. Good opportunity to kind of expand that. This would be above and beyond that global administrator or that device administrator that has local administrative privileges on all Azure AD joined devices. So we're going to kind of split the difference here, and it's fact as far as LAPS is concerned, but there are solutions out there that kind of make this fiction as well. We could use a similar tooling, if you will, in the hybrid or in the Azure AD joined scenario. All right. So we went through a bunch of different things. You can see that Azure AD joined does provide us with 95% of the same capabilities as hybrid Azure AD joined devices. Some of the advantages of Azure AD joined devices over hybrid Azure AD joined is Azure AD joined devices, you don't join the local domain anymore. We don't need to be in line of sight to a domain controller. It enables users to change their password without needing to be connected to the domain. There is password right back. I will throw that out there. The computer never loses its domain connectivity, and it makes it more difficult for attackers to move laterally between computers. Okay, that's kind of a cool one. And lastly, Windows Hello for Business deployment is much simpler. It's a 5-click, a configuration profile and a setting setup in Azure AD join for Windows Hello for Business. Whereas if you want to do Hybrid Azure AD join and Windows Hello for Business, there's certificates involved. It's like a 5-10 page document with Microsoft to get that stood up. It's a heavier lift. It's a little bit more complicated. You can still use it, but it's not as built in and nice as Azure AD joined. Some additional advantages to Azure AD join. A lot of companies think that Azure AD joined devices and local domain can't go hand in hand, when in fact they work perfectly together. We talked about earlier with those the Kerberos tickets and things getting passed back and forth. As long as users are created in your local domain and synced with Azure AD Connect, your users are able to use on-premise resources through SSO. We can make that happen all day long. And lastly, just kind of a little caveat, regardless of Hybrid Azure AD join or, thanks, Eric, or Azure AD joined or Hybrid Azure AD joined devices, Autopilot, we can deploy Autopilot devices either way. You can make it work. Your Hybrid Azure AD join is a little bit bigger of a lift, depending on how you want to deploy that. The hardest part with Hybrid Azure AD joined devices and Autopilot, especially if you ship it to their home, is at Windows sign-on, at one point that machine has to talk to the domain controller. So you do need a VPN of some sort, and it's usually always on VPN or sign in before login VPN to make that Autopilot experience to work. So you can get there. Blockers to use Azure AD join devices are the couple we reiterated earlier. If you're using existing business critical old school applications, which required hard coded AD connectivity, this will break. We can't do that. And then lastly, scenarios which require authentication, device authentication for like Radius, Wi-Fi and whatnot, that'll fail as well because the device isn't getting synced up. Okay, so key takeaways. Decide where your device strategy sits on the maturity model. Schedule a foundational identity analysis with this or tenant health check to see where you're currently at and where you can go. And then draw the line in the sand. If you don't have those last two scenarios, make the conscious decision to start to Azure AD join your devices and get it set up in the proper way. That way you have a path forward to maturing to the cloud without having to reprovision and reset up devices. The migration for a Hybrid Azure AD join device to an Azure AD join device is a painful one because the way that device joins and connects up. So draw the line in the sand. Go Azure AD join as much as you can. And those small use cases, Windows 7, Windows 8, or the two previous examples given, those can stay Hybrid Azure AD join, but you can begin to move the rest of your devices to an Azure AD join scenario. And luckily with Endpoint Manager, you can mix and match. You can manage both those devices in one ecosystem. I'm going to open up chat for questions. Type any questions you have in the chat. And while you do that, I'm going to give you kind of Microsoft's announcements from last week at Microsoft Ignite. Kind of give you some tips and tricks. There are things that are coming down the pipe that they announced at Ignite. So I'll watch the chat. We'll answer those as they come up. But let me throw you some Ignite nuggets. Okay. All right, first thing they announced, one of the things they announced is that Endpoint Manager adds management and compliance checks for Linux desktops. You can begin to extend that to the Linux desktops and have some conditional access policies in place on these devices now. It's not a full device control like an Azure AD joined. It appears to be an AD registered, but you can start to bring at least those Linux devices into your system and reap the reward of actually monitoring or requiring conditional access to get into those devices. Preview functionality released early 2022, so next year. Another one, custom compliance for Windows. So Windows 10, Windows 11 devices. You're not limited to the canned compliance policies that are in Endpoint Manager. You can actually create your own compliance detections on the device and then require conditional that to be part of your compliance and then leverage that against conditional access. So if you want a specific TPM chip, you could look for that through PowerShell, report that back to Endpoint Manager, and now you can enforce these custom compliance scenarios for devices up to Endpoint Manager and become more strict or restrictive, if you will. Again, it's in preview right now, so if you're interested in that, let us know. This is a big one. This is kind of cool. Manage security policies for unenrolled Microsoft Defender or endpoint devices. Basically, you have the ability to manage security policies of devices onboarded to Microsoft Defender for endpoint that are not managed by Endpoint Manager. So think about that. If you deploy endpoint for Defender for endpoint to a server, we can now leverage Endpoint Manager to apply security policies to that server, even though it's not managed by Endpoint Manager. Kind of opens the doorway on the security side of things for some of these devices that we don't have full endpoint management control over. That's a big one, and that's gonna be a game changer as far as securing those devices and how you do it. It's kind of gradually rolling into that SCCM role where you can manage servers on-prem, but not really a big cloud solution there yet. For the Apple side of things, you can now deploy DMG type application to Macs instead of doing the fun process of converting a DMG to another file type, adding a cert to it, putting a signed cert on it, then wrapping it up in the Intune Mac file, and then deploying it. We can now deploy straight DMG applications to manage Macs. Currently, it supports available with enrollment, so they could go to the Intune portal and install a DMG just fine. And coming first quarter, you can make those applications required and do uninstall with DMG. So that's a big change. Makes life a little bit easier for managing Macs. Have you ever wondered how big of a pain in the butt it is to register your iOS or iPad devices into Intune as a device registered device? They've simplified it. This is coming in the first half of 2022. They're taking it from like a 30-step process down to like a 5 or 6 step. Basically, they're going to give you the capability to use any modern app. Say you sign into Teams and authenticate with your Microsoft Authenticator, and it will register that device into your tenant. You necessarily won't have to install company portal on your iPhones and then enroll your device. They'll have other doorways, and they've simplified this process significantly. So that's a welcome change in my book for iOS and iPad modern authentication and registration. So that's awesome. And Hector's thrilled. Okay, last little nugget. They're opening up Android open source project support. So any of these Android applications that you'd use in a manufacturing facility, custom software for those facilities, they're actually opening it up so you can start to manage these devices through Endpoint Manager. Currently, RealWare is the way to go for that. That'll be supported by Endpoint Manager, but they're opening the doorway so that we can bring additional devices, additional softwares that are custom to a specific organization, and we could deploy that and manage that with Endpoint Manager. Okay. Any other questions? 35. This guy, Mike perked up. Yeah, camera's true. So there you go. The managed security policies for unenrolled Microsoft Defender for endpoint devices. So again, the key is your license. The device is licensed for Defender for endpoint. We can now trigger that to sync into Endpoint Manager, and we can start to push security policies to those devices through the Defender for endpoint mechanism. It's not really an Intune management. It's coming through your Defender for endpoint, which does monitoring and remediation on its own. So cool stuff coming down the pipe. If you have any other questions, throw them in the chat. Yeah, Mark, I believe they will make the recording available. Hope to have that for you, but it's been fun. Throw your questions in the chat and I'll try to get to them, or email us or contact us directly and we can see what we can scope out to kind of have a conversation and see where we can take you to kind of migrate you into the Azure AD joined device realm of things and kind of help you move towards the cloud a little bit more.